The most academically accomplished of the 9 UN Secretary Generals, Egyptian scholar and diplomat Boutros Ghali has never before had a historical biography written in English. The first African and first Arab to occupy the post, Boutros Ghali held the office in the 5 post-Cold War years between 1992 and 1996, massively expanding UN peacekeeping and leading intellectual debates on development, democratization and human rights. The author of his English biography is Professor Adikeya Adebayo, a senior research fellow at the University of Pretoria Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He's previously served on United Nations missions in South Africa, Western Sahara and Iraq. He joins us now for more on this biography. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
In maybe trying to understand why we have never captured his history before in English, perhaps let's talk about Boutros Ghali himself. Who is he?
Well, Boutros Ghali was, as you noted, one of the most intellectually accomplished of the UN Secretaries General. He was from a very noble Coptic Christian family in Egypt. So his grandfather had been the Prime Minister of Egypt and was assassinated in 1910 by an extremist. He had 2 uncles that had been foreign ministers, another that was agriculture minister. And he went on to have a very rewarding academic life and very impressive academic life. At the age of 27, he became a professor at the University of Cairo, teaching international law and international relations. And he published over 100 articles, the first book on the United Nations in Arabic, and one of the earliest studies of the then Organization of African Unity, before going on to be Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for 14 years, between 1977 and 81. And then he became UN Secretary General later. So that was what his career was.
And the kind of person that he is, I think at one point in the book you detail about how his father, having come from a well-esteemed family, made him choose between getting an apartment in France or getting a car. He chose the car, a decision which he later questioned himself. But what does this inform us about his character that actually even prepared him for the role at the United Nations?
I mean, I think that you have few of the 9 UN Secretaries General who were so steeped in the kind of issues that they had to deal with in the office. So, for example, not only was he a scholar of the United Nations, his doctorate from the University of Saumur in France had been on the role of the Arab League. And he looked at regional organizations and how they could help the United Nations. He also studied non-alignment, and that was one of his major issues. But Boutros Ghali consistently believed that multilateralism and the international order was the most important thing, and sovereignty was a way of protecting weak countries against more powerful ones. So he believed very strongly in international order. He'd studied these things, done conferences on them, and also ran the Al-Aram Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo while he was an academic. And then for the 14 years, 1977 to 1991, I think I may have said 81, as Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt, he was involved in the Middle East peace process and the peace treaty that was signed between Egypt and Israel in 1979, and then spent much time trying to prevent Egypt's isolation from the Arab world and also from the non-aligned movement and the Organization of African Unity. So he'd had a very broad experience, both through his very Western liberal education and his experiences in global South diplomacy, that prepared him for the job very well.
Right. Let's speak about, you mentioned non-alignment. I mean, in 2023, there's a lot that is being said about the continent being wooed so that they can distance themselves from Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine. You document how he dealt with the issue of non-alignment, and you note that he struggled to put the ideas into practice as a diplomat. How so?
Well, as UN Secretary General, you're basically the servant to powerful members of the UN Security Council. And there are 5 permanent members, you know, the US, China, Russia, France, and Britain. And these are the countries that call the shots at the UN and on the UN Security Council. They make most of the most important decisions, and all 5 of them have veto power, meaning that no decisions can be made without their approval. So, as they often like to say, the UN Secretary General is a secretary rather than a general. They want someone who is carrying out the instructions of the Security Council. And some of the difficulties that Boutros Ghali experienced as UN Secretary General involved, you know, Western countries pushing him to sanction Libya and Iraq, some of which he thought was unfair, but he had to do it. He felt in Bosnia and Rwanda that the Security Council was also setting up the UN almost for failure, because they weren't giving them the tools to be able to succeed, but yet the UN would be scapegoated for the failures in both of those conflict situations in the 1990s, where slaughters basically occurred. But he tried as much as he could to stand up against the powerful countries, accusing them of focusing too much on what he called rich men's wars in the Balkans, in Bosnia, while neglecting Africa's orphan conflicts. And he tried, as you said, as you noted, to push issues of development, of human rights, of democratization, holding mega conferences also to focus on issues like women, human rights, the environment, social development, population. But there are rather limited powers that the UN Secretary General has, and you cannot dictate to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. They are the ones that have to make the decisions that the Secretary General implements.
With some of his strong beliefs when it came to the conflict on the continent and the attention that it deserved, how much has the needle shifted? In 2023, you still find on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council, at least, that the agenda is about conflict on the continent, the majority of it, yet to date, no African country has a permanent seat.
It's true. 84% of the United Nations, around 90,000 peacekeepers, are deployed in African theaters. So Africa is the main consumer, if you like, of the UN Security Council's peacekeeping. And typically, around 60% of the cases that are discussed on the Security Council relate to Africa. But yet, Africa has 3 rotating seats in the 15-member Security Council. But along with Latin America, Africa is the only major region in the world which does not have a permanent member with veto power. And the last time that the UN Security Council was expanded was in 1965, when it was expanded from 11 to 15. Since then, no expansion has happened. The U.S. President Joseph Biden, during the UN General Assembly last September, actually came out publicly in support of an expansion of UN Security Council to take in Africa and Latin America and others. But there's a feeling that there are some members, like Russia and China, who are more reluctant to expand the Security Council more than its current size. But certainly there's a kind of system of global apartheid happening, where some of the global south countries are not properly represented on the Security Council, and that erodes its legitimacy and gives it the sense that this is a relic of the past. You can't have a body set up in 1945 reflecting the power dynamics of 75 years ago rather than today.
Ali Mazrui offers a Pax Africana. Is that something that is so impossible for us to adopt?
Well, the idea of a Pax Africana is basically that Africans have to create and consolidate peace on their own continent. But for a Pax Africana to happen, you need the military bases that the US, France, China, and all the activities of the Russians in Central African Republic, in the Sahel, those need to be dismantled if Africa is going to come up with its own self-sustaining security mechanism. But of course, this needs to be done in conjunction and collaboration with the United Nations, which I think is the only body with universal representation and legitimacy. But Africa certainly needs to come up with its own African standby force that it's been talking about since 2003, and that should have been created about 2 decades ago.
In the book, you speak about Boutros Ghali's legacy. What is it that you want people to walk away knowing, having read this book?
You know, the most important reason why I wrote this book is that, as I said, all of the other UN Secretaries General had biographies written on them in some form or another. And I felt that there was a kind of almost deliberate erasure of Boutros Ghali by parts of the Western academia and analysts. You know, a lot of Western analysts found Boutros Ghali very arrogant, almost as if he was some kind of uppity native. And I felt that with somebody of his pedigree, his intellectual standing, and also some of his successes in places like Mozambique, in places like Cambodia and El Salvador, you had peacekeeping successes. And he also came up with the conceptual framework in his 1992 An Agenda for Peace for peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building that is still very relevant today. So I felt he needed to be accorded his proper place in history. He had his faults and failures in Rwanda and Bosnia and elsewhere, but I felt that he needed to be treated like any other historical figure. And he was someone of substance, one of the most, I think, impressive scholar diplomats of the last century.
Someone who managed to not only focus on the Arab world, because on the continent at least, because many at times, or some sectors of society widely believe that the North Africa is sort of cut off from the rest of the continent, what is called Black Africa, but he managed to strike that balance.
Absolutely. I mean, he was the first African and the first Arab UN Secretary General when he was elected in 1992. And I think something that made Boutros Ghali unique was that as an academic, he traveled very widely within Africa, you know, to conferences, and he wrote on the Organization of African Unity. And as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for 14 years, he actually covered the Organization of African Unity. So he had a very deep and very sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of African diplomacy and politics.
This question usually is tricky, right? But you've studied his work, you've had to go through the archive to put this book together. We spoke of the concept of Pax Africana and how to date we are still struggling when it comes to organizing ourselves in terms of peace efforts on the continent. Somebody like him, who had such an impressive and a solid footprint in paving the way, I guess. What do you perceive, perhaps, in 2023 he would be saying about where we are as a continent?
I think Boutros Ghali would be, I mean, he died in 2016, so just 7 years ago. Yeah. So he did see a lot of what emerged in post-Cold War Africa. I think he'd probably be disappointed that we haven't made more progress in terms of the African Union and its early promise in terms of being able to, you know, really be a strong African voice and strong African presence for the continent. Having said that, the African Union's Peace and Security Council has done quite a lot of good work in the security field and is listened to within the UN Security Council. So I think he'd be pleased about that. And in terms of the North Africa and the Middle East, because Boutros Ghali, as a young youth, was really a pan-Arabist. He had a kind of vision for a regional unity and almost taken it from the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He wanted Arab unity, and he felt that Egypt needed to lead a group of states around Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, etc. So I think he'd be disappointed that some of those dreams and aspirations of regional cooperation have not quite happened in both Africa and the Middle East as well.
Thank you very much for your time this morning and for talking to us about the book, Boutros Ghali. You can pick it up at your local bookstore.
Sure.
It's available.
Sure.
Thank you very much to Professor Adekeye Adebajo.
Thank you.